The October evening had settled over Lady Whitcombe's estate with that particular crispness that transforms an English autumn into something almost theatrical. The great hall of Whitcombe Manor blazed with the warm glow of dozens of candles, their flames reflected in the polished oak floors and the jeweled throats of the assembled guests. Lady Constance Whitcombe, resplendent in midnight blue silk with her late husband's diamonds, moved through the gathering with the practiced grace of a woman who had been orchestrating such events for 30 years. Her annual harvest ball was the undisputed highlight of St. Mary Mead's social calendar, drawing the county's finest families and, inevitably, their most carefully guarded secrets. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly in her customary corner, a delicate porcelain teacup balanced on her knee, her pale blue eyes taking in the familiar tableau with the gentle interest of a naturalist observing a particularly fascinating species. At 73, she had attended enough such gatherings to recognize the subtle patterns that emerged when respectable people gathered for an evening's entertainment. Her knitting needles clicked softly as she worked on a cream-colored shawl, but her attention was entirely focused on the human drama unfolding before her. There was young Captain Hastings, Lady Whitcombe's nephew, whose charm was exceeded only by his debts, paying rather desperate court to Miss Penelope Ashford, the banker's daughter whose inheritance was as substantial as her conversation was limited. Miss Marple noted how his smile never quite reached his eyes, and how his fingers drummed nervously against his champagne glass when he thought no one was watching. Near the French windows, Mr. Jason Carmichael, the mysterious newcomer who had rented the old Thornfield cottage, engaged Mrs. Dorothy Bantry in animated conversation, his continental manners and vague references to business interests abroad having made him the subject of considerable village speculation. The evening's entertainment proceeded with clockwork precision. The string quartet from the nearby market town played Strauss with more enthusiasm than skill, while couples moved across the dance floor in the stately patterns that had changed little since Lady Whitcombe's own debut 40 years earlier. Miss Marple observed the subtle tensions beneath the polite veneer, the way Lady Whitcombe's companion, Miss Eleanor Thorne, kept glancing toward the library door with barely concealed anxiety. How Mr. Reginald Fortescue, Lady Whitcombe's business manager, seemed unusually distracted, checking his pocket watch repeatedly and starting at unexpected sounds. The first indication that this evening would prove memorable came at precisely 10:15, when a woman's scream shattered the genteel murmur of conversation. It erupted from the direction of the library, that sanctuary of leather-bound volumes where Lady Whitcombe often retreated to conduct her more private business. The music stopped abruptly, conversations died mid-sentence, and for a moment the great hall held its collective breath in that peculiar suspension that follows an unexpected shock. Miss Marple set down her teacup with characteristic precision, and rose slowly, allowing the younger guests to surge ahead while her keen eyes missed nothing of the unfolding scene. Lady Whitcombe herself was already at the library door, her face pale but composed, attempting to maintain some semblance of order as guests pressed forward with the morbid curiosity that seems to overtake even the most well-bred individuals in moments of crisis. Inside the library, illuminated by the warm glow of a reading lamp, sat Mr. Fortescue in one of the green leather armchairs. At first glance, he appeared to be sleeping, his head tilted back against the chair's high back, his evening clothes immaculate. But Miss Marple, with her lifetime of village experience, immediately recognized the unnatural stillness, the particular quality of silence that accompanies death. His right hand still clutched a crystal brandy glass, though its contents had spilled across his white waistcoat in a dark stain that caught the lamplight. Dr. Haydock, the village physician, pushed through the crowd with professional authority, though Miss Marple noticed the slight tremor in his hands as he knelt beside the chair. After a brief examination, he looked up with the grave expression that medical men reserve for the most serious of pronouncements. "I'm afraid Mr. Fortescue has passed away," he announced quietly. "The circumstances are unusual." We should notify the police immediately. The suggestion of police involvement sent a visible shudder through the gathering. Miss Marple observed with interest how different individuals reacted to this prospect. Captain Hastings had gone quite pale and seemed to be calculating the distance to the nearest exit, while Mrs. Bantry appeared positively thrilled at the prospect of being involved in what she was already describing as a real mystery. Miss Thorne stood perfectly still, her face a mask of polite concern, though her gloved hands were clenched so tightly that the fabric strained across her knuckles. As the evening drew to its premature close and Inspector Slack arrived from the market town with his sergeant, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the curious nature of human behavior in times of crisis. She had noticed several small details that seemed to escape official attention. The faint, bitter almond scent that lingered near Mr. Fortescue's glass, the small piece of violet notepaper that had fallen beneath his chair, and most intriguingly, the fact that his usually prominent gold pocket watch was missing, though the chain remained intact across his waistcoat. The pleasant facade of Lady Whitcombe's ball had been irrevocably shattered, and Miss Marple, with her quiet, unassuming observations, was already beginning to weave the threads of human nature into a pattern that would soon reveal the truth hidden beneath St. Mary Mead's respectable surface. Inspector Slack possessed the particular brand of efficiency that made sensitive people feel as though they were being catalogued rather than questioned. He moved through Lady Whitcombe's guests with methodical precision, his notebook recording statements with mechanical scratches of his pencil, while his pale eyes missed nothing of the subtle tensions that rippled beneath the evening's shattered veneer. Miss Marple, having positioned herself with characteristic unobtrusiveness near the library door, observed the proceedings with the gentle attention of a naturalist studying a particularly fascinating species under stress. The violet notepaper, retrieved from beneath Mr. Fortescue's chair, had become the evening's most intriguing artifact. Inspector Slack held it with the reverent care usually reserved for evidence that might prove decisive, though his expression suggested he found its feminine scent and schoolgirl associations rather beneath the dignity of serious criminal investigation. The message, written in hurried pencil, "10 then, come alone," carried an urgency that seemed at odds with the measured formality of Lady Whitcombe's social gathering. "Who among you ladies uses violet notepaper?" Slack inquired with the blunt directness that had made him simultaneously feared and effective throughout the county. The question produced a flutter of nervous glances and defensive adjustments of jewelry that Miss Marple found infinitely more revealing than the actual responses. Miss Penelope Ashford, the banker's daughter whose inheritance had made her the evening's most pursued dance partner, colored prettily and admitted that she did indeed favor lavender stationery, though she hastened to add that such paper was readily available at any decent stationer's, and surely half the ladies present might possess similar sheets. Captain Hastings, Lady Whitcombe's nephew, seemed to find the carpet pattern suddenly fascinating as Slack's attention turned to him. "You mentioned a business matter with the deceased captain. Perhaps you could elaborate on the nature of this discussion." The young man's military bearing, so impressive on the dance floor, appeared to desert him entirely under official scrutiny. His explanation, something about hunt subscriptions and quarterly payments, emerged in disjointed fragments that convinced no one, least of all Inspector Slack, whose pencil recorded not only the words, but the lengthy pauses between them. Mr. Jason Carmichael, the mysterious continental gentleman who had so charmed the village with his vague references to business interests abroad, maintained his composure with practiced ease, though Miss Marple noted how his fingers drummed against his cigarette case in a rhythm that suggested considerable inattention. His account of the missed appointment was delivered with the smooth precision of a man accustomed to explaining himself to officials, yet something in his manner reminded Miss Marple of a performance she had once witnessed at the village amateur dramatic society, technically proficient but somehow lacking in genuine conviction. Dr. Haydock, having completed his preliminary examination, drew Inspector Slack aside for a consultation conducted in medical terminology that effectively excluded the assembled guests from its more disturbing implications. Miss Marple, however, possessed sufficient experience with village emergencies to recognize the significance of the doctor's grave expression and the way his hands trembled slightly as he cleaned his spectacles. When he emerged from this professional conference, his announcement was carefully neutral. Further examination would be required to determine the precise cause of death, though certain preliminary observations suggested the matter was not entirely straightforward. The missing pocket watch had become another source of considerable speculation. Mr. Fortescue's gold timepiece, a substantial affair that had belonged to his father and grandfather before him, was nowhere to be found despite the presence of its chain across his waistcoat. Lady Whitcombe, when questioned about possible thieves among her staff, drew herself up with aristocratic indignation and declared that her household had been in service for decades and their integrity was beyond question. Yet Miss Marple observed how Miss Eleanor Thorne, the lady's companion, seemed to find this declaration somewhat less convincing than her employer intended, her gloved hands twisting together in a gesture that spoke of considerable inner distress. The butler, Mr. Ellison, provided a detailed account of the evening's service arrangements with the precision that only comes from decades of managing grand households. Young Arthur, the footman who had served the final brandy, stammered through his testimony with the obvious terror of a servant who finds himself suddenly central to matters far beyond his understanding. His description of Mr. Fortescue's demeanor, preoccupied, perhaps slightly agitated, but certainly not appearing ill, added another layer to the evening's mounting mysteries. As the formal questioning continued, Miss Marple found herself increasingly fascinated by the small details that seemed to escape official attention. The faint granular residue she had noticed on the library desk's edge remained unexplained, as did the curious fact that Mr. Fortescue's brandy glass, though spilled, had left a stain pattern that suggested the liquid had been disturbed after his collapse rather than during it. These observations, she knew, were best kept for later consideration when the obvious avenues of investigation had been exhausted. Mrs. Bantry, unable to contain her excitement at being involved in what she already described as a real mystery, provided an enthusiastic account of her conversation with Miss Thorne at precisely 10:15, thus establishing an alibi for Lady Whitcombe's companion at the crucial moment. Yet Miss Marple noticed how Miss Thorne herself seemed less grateful for this corroboration than might have been expected, her acknowledgment delivered with the resigned air of someone accepting an unwelcome necessity. The evening's final revelation came when Inspector Slack announced that the library would remain sealed pending further investigation, and that none of the guests were to leave the village without informing the police of their whereabouts. This pronouncement transformed what had begun as a tragic accident into something far more serious, sending visible tremors through the assembled company. Captain Hastings went quite pale and immediately began calculating distances to various exits, while Mr. Carmichael's continental Polish seemed to develop several hairline cracks. As the guests finally dispersed into the cold October night, Miss Marple gathered her knitting with characteristic deliberation and reflected on the curious human tendency to reveal more of themselves under pressure than they ever intended. The evening had provided her with a fascinating study in human nature, and she suspected that the morning would bring even more intriguing developments as the village awakened to find itself at the center of what promised to be a most complex and revealing investigation. The truth, she knew from long experience, had a way of emerging despite the most careful attempts at concealment, though it rarely appeared in the form that people expected. Tonight's tragedy was merely the beginning of a story that would ultimately reveal far more about St. Mary Mead's respectable inhabitants than any of them had ever intended to share. The morning sun cast a deceptively cheerful light across St. Mary Mead, though the village itself hummed with the particular energy that follows unexpected tragedy. News of Mr. Fortescue's death had spread with the inexorable efficiency that characterizes small communities, flowing from kitchen to parlor like tea through a strainer. Miss Marple, taking her customary morning walk to the post office, observed how the usual patterns of daily routine had been transformed into something resembling a carefully choreographed dance of curiosity and concern. Mrs. Price Ridley, emerging from the baker's with her morning rolls, lingered conspicuously near the village green where she might intercept any passer-by willing to share additional details about the previous evening's tragedy. Her declaration that she had detected the distinct scent of bitter almonds near the library had already achieved the status of established fact, though Miss Marple noted with interest how this claim had grown more definitive with each retelling. The post office itself had become an unofficial headquarters for speculation, with Miss Weatherby, the postmistress, dispensing stamps and theories with equal authority. Her account of Inspector Slack's early morning telephone call to Scotland Yard had grown considerably more dramatic in the retelling. Though Miss Marple suspected the essential facts remained accurate, Mr. Fortescue's death was now officially classified as suspicious, and additional investigators were expected before noon. Miss Marple purchased her stamps with characteristic deliberation, allowing the conversation to flow around her, while her pale blue eyes missed nothing of the subtle undercurrents that revealed themselves in moments of communal excitement. She noted how young Arthur, the footman who had served the final brandy, passed the post office window with the hunched shoulders of a man carrying an invisible burden. His usual cheerful demeanor replaced by a haunted expression that spoke of sleepless hours spent replaying the evening's events. More significantly, she observed Captain Hastings leaving the rectory side gate at a speed that suggested someone might be measuring how fast guilt could travel. He lifted his hat in a movement a fraction too late and strode on, jaw set with determination. Miss Marple, pretending to study the parish notice board, noticed several scraps of blackened paper scattered on the gravel by the gate. With the delicate dexterity that comes from years of managing household economies, she bent as if adjusting her shoe and gathered one fragment between finger and thumb. The charred piece bore the faint tint of violet and showed the remnants of what might have been the tail of a letter, though the fire had rendered most of it illegible. More intriguingly, it carried the ghost of that particular fragrance she had noticed on the notepaper found beneath Mr. Fortescue's chair, though altered as burnt perfumes always are. Dr. Haydock's visit to her cottage shortly after 11 provided confirmation of what the village had already begun to suspect. The preliminary examination suggests prussic acid, he confided over tea and scones, his usually jovial manner subdued by professional gravity. The granular residue on the library desk appears to be sugar, possibly used to mask the taste. There's also evidence of a slight burn on the interior of the brandy glass, consistent with a caustic substance. Miss Marple poured tea with practiced hospitality while processing this information. Not everyone can detect the scent of bitter almonds, she observed mildly. One reads that it requires a particular sensitivity. Quite so, and sometimes people claim to smell what they think they ought to have noticed, Haydock replied with a grimace. What troubles me more is that missing pocket watch. Fortescue was obsessively punctual, never went anywhere without it. The chain remained intact, which suggests either haste or deliberate meaning in its removal. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor in the form of Miss Eleanor Thorne, Lady Whitcombe's companion, who appeared at Miss Marple's cottage door with the particular combination of determination and desperation that suggests someone driven by circumstances beyond their control. Her usually impeccable appearance showed signs of strain, and her gloved hands trembled slightly as she accepted the offered tea. Miss Marple, I find myself in need of perspective, she began, her voice carrying carefully modulated tones that couldn't entirely conceal her distress. Her account of recent events proved illuminating in ways she perhaps hadn't intended. Mr. Fortescue had been working late in the library for several evenings, she revealed, appearing increasingly agitated about what she carefully characterized as seasonal business concerns. More significantly, she mentioned with studied casualness that violet notepaper was readily available in the morning room writing desk, where anyone might have access to it. The very deliberateness of this observation made Miss Marple suspect it was anything but casual. Miss Thorne also expressed concerns about Captain Hastings' financial situation, noting that Lady Whitcombe's generosity toward her nephew might have been somewhat misplaced. As her visitor prepared to leave, Miss Thorne made one final observation that seemed almost accidental in its delivery. "I do hope this unfortunate business won't reflect poorly on Lady Whitcombe's household. There have been challenges in recent months that have required considerable discretion." The emphasis she placed on the word discretion suggested complexities that might prove highly relevant to the current investigation. After Miss Thorne's departure, Miss Marple sat quietly in her garden, her knitting needles clicking softly as she processed the morning's revelations. The pattern emerging suggested financial pressures, family obligations, and the kind of secrets that respectable people will go to considerable lengths to protect. She reflected on the curious fact that an express letter from Naples, delivered to Mr. Fortescue the previous morning, had mysteriously disappeared from the sealed library. The afternoon post brought a hastily scrawled note from Mrs. Bantry requesting Miss Marple's immediate presence at Gossington Hall. The urgency of the message, combined with its deliberately vague phrasing, suggested that something significant had occurred, though Mrs. Bantry's natural tendency toward drama made it difficult to assess the true importance of whatever discovery she wished to share. As Miss Marple prepared for this unexpected excursion, she found herself reflecting on the curious human tendency to reveal truth through the very attempts to conceal it, and wondered what new revelations the afternoon might bring to light in this increasingly complex web of village secrets. Gossington Hall welcomed Miss Marple with its familiar atmosphere of comfortable chaos, where decades of accumulated books, hunting prints, and well-worn upholstery transformed even the most serious matters into something almost companionable. Mrs. Bantry received her with the bright-eyed intensity of a conspirator who had been rehearsing her revelations since dispatching the urgent note, her bracelets chiming with nervous energy as she poured coffee and shooed away the hovering maid with theatrical discretion. "You were absolutely right to come immediately," Mrs. Bantry began, her voice dropping to conspiratorial tones. "Our gardener made the most extraordinary discovery this morning while clearing the old summer house. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard, wrapped in oiled cloth, was a leather portfolio bearing Mr. Fortescue's initials." She produced the weathered case with ceremonial gravity, its contents revealing a complexity that extended far beyond the village's understanding of the deceased's business affairs. The documents painted a picture of financial intrigue that Miss Marple found both illuminating and troubling. Letters from Italian banking houses, investment certificates in foreign currencies, and detailed accountings of substantial sums moving through various European accounts suggested that Mr. Fortescue had been managing not only Lady Whitcombe's estate, but serving as financial intermediary for several county families. One letter, dated merely 3 days before his death, expressed urgent concern about irregularities requiring immediate attention and proposed a meeting to discuss what the writer delicately termed the Naples situation. Miss Marple examined these revelations with the careful attention she usually reserved for particularly intricate knitting patterns, noting how each document seemed to expand the circle of potential suspects far beyond the obvious candidates who had attended Lady Whitcombe's ball. The implications were staggering. If Mr. Fortescue had indeed been involved in financial irregularities, or worse, if he had discovered such irregularities perpetrated by others, the list of those with compelling motives for his silence grew considerably. Their study was interrupted by the arrival of Mr. Jason Carmichael, whose appearance at Gossington Hall struck Miss Marple as remarkably convenient given the nature of their discovery. His explanation for the visit, concern about Mrs. Bantry's well-being following the previous evening's tragedy, carried the smooth plausibility that had characterized all his village interactions, yet something in his manner suggested more pressing motivations lurking beneath his continental polish. When Mrs. Bantry, with characteristic directness, mentioned their discovery of financial documents, Carmichael's reaction provided Miss Marple with her first glimpse beneath his carefully maintained facade. The momentary tightening around his eyes, the slight pause before his expression resumed its usual pleasant neutrality, spoke volumes about his interest in matters that should theoretically concern a village newcomer not at all. Financial irregularities can be terribly distressing for families involved, he observed, with practiced sympathy, his fingers drumming against his cigarette case in that familiar rhythm of inner tension. I do hope Lady Whitcombe won't find herself compromised by whatever poor Fortescue may have discovered. The phrasing struck Miss Marple as oddly specific, suggesting knowledge of circumstances that his recent arrival should not have provided. After Carmichael's departure, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the curious coincidence of his arrival at precisely the moment when potentially damaging evidence had come to light. Her return journey via the Manor's public footpath provided an opportunity for further observation, as she glimpsed Captain Hastings through the morning-room windows, engaged in what appeared to be an increasingly heated discussion with his aunt. Lady Whitcombe's usually composed demeanor showed signs of strain, her gestures sharp with the controlled anger that suggests family disappointments of long standing. Their conversation, though inaudible from Miss Marple's position, clearly centered on matters of considerable urgency. Captain Hastings produced several documents from his jacket, spreading them across the morning-room table with gestures that spoke of desperation rather than confidence. The scene concluded with Captain Hastings gathering the documents hastily and departing through the French windows, his military bearing replaced by the furtive movements of someone avoiding observation. Miss Marple, continuing her apparently casual stroll, noted how he paused at the ornamental pond to tear several papers into small pieces, scattering them among the water lilies with the methodical thoroughness of someone destroying evidence. Inspector Slack's return that evening brought confirmation of what the village had begun to suspect. The post-mortem examination had definitively established death by prussic acid poisoning administered in sufficient quantity to ensure rapid effect. More significantly, fragments of the missing Naples letter had been recovered from the library fireplace, though fire damage had rendered most of it illegible. The surviving pieces suggested correspondence about financial transfers that had gone seriously awry. "We've had rather interesting developments regarding Captain Hastings," Slack announced with the satisfaction of a man who saw his case falling into place. "Substantial gambling debts, pressing Mr. Fortescue for a loan just yesterday afternoon and being refused quite emphatically. Add to that his key to the library, courtesy of Lady Whitcombe's generosity, and we have motive, means, and opportunity in a rather tidy package." The inspector's confidence in this obvious solution struck Miss Marple as premature, though she kept her reservations characteristically understated. Her years of village observation had taught her to be particularly wary of cases that appeared too convenient, especially when they involved individuals whose desperation made them easy targets for suspicion. As the evening progressed and Chief Inspector Davy arrived from Scotland Yard to oversee the investigation, Miss Marple found herself increasingly convinced that the obvious solution might prove entirely wrong. The evidence against Captain Hastings, while compelling on the surface, seemed almost too carefully arranged, as if someone had taken considerable care to ensure that his financial difficulties would provide the perfect cover for more complex motives. The scope of the financial irregularities suggested by the hidden documents, combined with Carmichael's suspicious knowledge and the methodical destruction of evidence, painted a picture far more intricate than a desperate nephew's crime of opportunity. Miss Marple reflected on the curious fact that the most obvious explanation for murder was often the one that concealed the most complex truth, and she suspected that the morning would bring revelations that would challenge everyone's assumptions about the respectable inhabitants of St. Mary Mead. The missing pocket watch continued to trouble her, as did the granular residue on the library desk and the precise timing of events that had provided several individuals with convenient alibis. As she prepared for bed, Miss Marple found herself anticipating the next day's developments with the quiet satisfaction of someone who recognized that the real investigation was only just beginning. The morning brought Chief Inspector Davy from Scotland Yard with the particular combination of professional courtesy and methodical precision that distinguished him from Inspector Slack's more obvious enthusiasms. Unlike his local colleague, Davy possessed the rarer quality of recognizing that obvious solutions often concealed more complex truths, and he had learned through years of experience to value insights that emerged from unexpected quarters. Miss Marple, summoned discreetly by Lady Whitcombe for what was diplomatically termed moral support, arrived at the manor with her customary punctuality and a small posy of late chrysanthemums. The morning room felt unusually airless, as if the weight of the previous evening's tragedy still pressed upon its polished surfaces and silk lampshades. Lady Whitcombe received her guests with the gracious fatigue of a woman determined to meet calamity with dignity, while Miss Eleanor Thorne hovered at a tactful distance, offering tea with the measured efficiency that had become her armor against uncertainty. Miss Marple's pale blue eyes moved with apparent casualness to the writing desk by the window, where a pad of violet-tinted notepaper lay beside a silver-topped bottle of scent. "Such a dreadful disturbance," Lady Whitcombe murmured, accepting her tea with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly. "Mr. Fortescue was such a pillar of prudence. To die here, at my ball, in such circumstances—" Her voice trailed away into the particular silence that follows unthinkable events. Miss Marple set down her teacup with characteristic precision and drifted toward the window as if admiring the autumn garden. Her fingers brushed the blotter on the desk with the same absent curiosity she might have given to examining fabric at a draper's shop. The surface yielded the faintest of indentations, and she asked, in the mildest possible tone, if she might borrow a pencil to jot down the name of a particularly lovely rose variety. Miss Thorne supplied one immediately, and Miss Marple noted with interest that the companion's left hand bore a faint smudge of violet ink along the side of the little finger, the telltale mark of someone who writes left-handed and drags the edge of their hand across fresh script. With a light, almost playful touch, Miss Marple shaded the paper laid over the blotter. An outline emerged, ghostly but unmistakable, the curve of letters that resolved into "10 then, come alone." "How clever of you," Lady Whitcombe observed vaguely, not understanding the significance and perhaps not wishing to. Miss Thorne's lips pressed together in a line that might have indicated disapproval or concentration, while the violet scent seemed suddenly more pronounced in the morning air. Chief Inspector Davy's examination of the reconstructed evidence painted an increasingly complex picture of Mr. Fortescue's final days. The Naples correspondence, painstakingly reassembled from fireplace fragments, revealed that the deceased had been serving as financial intermediary for several substantial European transactions. More significantly, the letters suggested that Mr. Fortescue had recently discovered systematic irregularities in these accounts and was preparing to expose rather than conceal the discrepancies. "The curious thing," Davy confided to Miss Marple during a brief private consultation, "is that Fortescue appears to have been the one attempting to correct these problems. His final letter to the Italian banking house shows genuine alarm about what he had uncovered, and his request for an urgent meeting suggests he was preparing full disclosure of the situation." This revelation transformed the entire character of the investigation, shifting focus from a desperate nephew's crime of opportunity to the calculated elimination of an inconvenient witness. The implications extended far beyond Captain Hastings' gambling difficulties into territory that might implicate individuals whose reputations had never been questioned. In the servants' hall, Miss Marple encountered young Arthur polishing glassware with the anxious dedication of someone seeking refuge in familiar tasks. His account of the previous evening's service proved illuminating in ways he perhaps hadn't intended. Mr. Fortescue had specifically requested sugar for his brandy, Arthur revealed, though the bowl from the sideboard had contained the usual lumps intended for coffee service. More intriguingly, Arthur mentioned glimpsing something that glinted on the library mantelpiece when he first entered. "Like a watch, ma'am," though it had mysteriously vanished by the time he returned to tidy the room after the discovery of the body. The boy's testimony was interrupted by the arrival of Mr. Carmichael in the stable yard, his continental polish intact despite the morning's tensions. Miss Marple, adjusting her shawl by the scullery window, observed with interest as Arthur slipped outside on the pretext of emptying slops. The conversation that followed, conducted in urgent undertones, revealed Carmichael's particular interest in controlling the young footman's testimony. "You keep quiet about what you didn't see," Carmichael's smooth voice carried on the damp air. "No one expects a footman to notice details about timing. And if anyone asks, you were in the hall, yes? Not the corridor." The implicit threat in his words was unmistakable, wrapped though it was in civilized language. The afternoon brought the discovery that transformed Inspector Slack's confident case into something far more complex. Captain Hastings' motor car, searched with methodical thoroughness, yielded the missing pocket watch tucked away in a chamois bag within the toolbox. Yet when Chief Inspector Davy examined the timepiece, he discovered an anomaly that spoke volumes about the true nature of the crime. "This watch keeps perfect time," Davy observed, comparing it to the town hall clock visible through the library windows. "Yet Lady Whitcombe assures me that Mr. Fortescue always kept his watch 3 minutes fast, claiming it helped maintain his legendary punctuality." Miss Marple found this detail particularly illuminating when considered alongside the other carefully arranged evidence. A watch does not correct itself, and whoever had handled this timepiece had cared more about creating a convincing narrative than preserving authentic details. The precision suggested someone with intimate knowledge of how the investigation would proceed and considerable skill in directing suspicion toward convenient targets. As evening approached and the official case against Captain Hastings appeared to solidify, Miss Marple reflected on the curious pattern of evidence that seemed almost too convenient in its arrangement. Her years of village observation had taught her that the most elaborate deceptions often contained the seeds of their own exposure, and she suspected that the killer's very thoroughness might ultimately prove their undoing. The morning brought Chief Inspector Davy back to Whitcombe Manor with the methodical precision that distinguished him from Inspector Slack's more obvious enthusiasms. The gold pocket watch, examined under the clear light of day, had yielded its most significant secret. It kept perfect time, synchronized precisely with the town hall clock visible through the library windows. This discovery transformed what had appeared to be damning evidence against Captain Hastings into something far more sinister, a carefully planted clue designed to mislead the investigation. Mr. Fortescue was legendary for keeping his watch 3 minutes fast, Lady Whitcombe confirmed when pressed by Davy's gentle but persistent questioning. He claimed it ensured his punctuality, though we all learned to adjust our expectations accordingly. The implication hung heavy in the morning air. Whoever had handled this timepiece after the murder possessed intimate knowledge of how the investigation would proceed, yet lacked awareness of Fortescue's personal habits. Miss Marple, present at Lady Whitcombe's request for what was diplomatically termed moral support, found herself drawn to the morning room's writing desk, where a pad of violet-tinted notepaper lay beside a silver-topped scent bottle. With the gentle curiosity that had served her so well in previous village mysteries, she asked to borrow a pencil to jot down the name of a particularly lovely rose variety she had noticed in the garden. Miss Eleanor Thorne, Lady Whitcombe's companion, supplied the pencil immediately, though Miss Marple noted with interest the faint violet ink smudge along the side of her left little finger, the telltale mark of someone who writes left-handed and drags their hand across fresh script. With practiced delicacy, Miss Marple placed a fresh sheet over the desk's blotter and shaded it lightly with the pencil. Ghost-like letters emerged from the indentations. 10, then. Come alone. The revelation that the mysterious note had originated from Lady Whitcombe's own morning room transformed the entire character of the investigation. Miss Thorne's reaction to this discovery provided Miss Marple with crucial insight into the companion's state of mind. Her usual composure showed hairline cracks, and when Miss Marple made a seemingly innocent comment about the beauty of violet flowers in the garden, Miss Thorne's response was startling in its intensity. "The scent," she stammered, her voice trembling as she steadied herself against the desk. "It reminds me of things best forgotten." Her hands shook as she attempted to rearrange the writing materials, and Miss Marple observed how the violet notepaper seemed to affect her with an almost physical revulsion. Chief Inspector Davies' re-examination of the case had also yielded disturbing revelations about the financial irregularities that had so concerned Mr. Fortescue in his final days. The documents recovered from Mrs. Bantry's summer house painted a picture of systematic embezzlement operating through European banking channels, with particular emphasis on Italian connections that seemed to require specialized knowledge of international finance. Captain Hastings, when pressed for a more complete account of his circumstances, revealed a truth far more complex than simple gambling debts. His desperate conversation with Lady Whitcombe the previous day had concerned not cards or horses, but a youthful indiscretion involving forged securities that had haunted him for years. Mr. Fortescue had been his protector, helping to bury the scandal in exchange for ongoing obligations that had grown increasingly burdensome. "The papers I burned at the rectory gate," Hastings confessed with the relief of someone finally unburdening himself of a terrible secret, "were blackmail letters. Someone had discovered my past and was demanding payment. Fortescue was the only person who knew the full truth, and his death leaves me completely exposed." Lady Whitcombe's own revelations added another layer of complexity to the financial web surrounding her business manager's death. Her discovery that Fortescue had been investing substantial portions of her estate in speculative European ventures without her explicit knowledge had generated a fury that surprised even those who knew her well. "That man was supposed to be protecting my interests," she declared with uncharacteristic vehemence, "not risking everything on schemes I knew nothing about. If these investments have failed, the estate could be ruined." The implications were staggering. If Lady Whitcombe had discovered the extent of Fortescue's unauthorized activities, she possessed both motive and means for ensuring his silence. Meanwhile, Mr. Jason Carmichael's presence in the village was taking on increasingly sinister overtones. Mrs. Price Ridley's London connections had yielded disturbing information about his background, including involvement in foreign currency speculation that had attracted official government interest. More immediately concerning was his obvious familiarity with details of the investigation that should have been confidential. Miss Marple observed with particular interest a hushed conversation between Carmichael and Miss Thorne in the conservatory, their body language suggesting either shared secrets or veiled threats. Miss Thorne appeared increasingly distressed, while Carmichael maintained his continental Polish despite the obvious tension of their exchange. Young Arthur, emboldened by Chief Inspector Davies' gentler questioning techniques, provided additional details that cast the evening's events in a new light. His account of serving the final brandy included a curious detail about detecting the scent of metal polish in the library. Sharp-like, not the usual beeswax. More significantly, he mentioned glimpsing something that glinted on the mantelpiece when he first entered. "Like a watch, sir," though it had mysteriously vanished by the time he returned after the body's discovery. As the morning progressed and the investigation's focus shifted from obvious suspects to more complex possibilities, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the curious psychology of elaborate deception. The killer's very thoroughness in arranging evidence might ultimately provide the key to their identification, particularly since they had been forced to improvise when unexpected complications arose. The pattern emerging suggested not a crime of passion or desperation, but a carefully orchestrated elimination of an inconvenient witness who had stumbled upon criminal activities extending far beyond the village's respectable boundaries. The challenge now lay in identifying which of St. Mary Mead's seemingly innocent inhabitants possessed the knowledge, connections, and ruthless determination necessary to orchestrate such an elaborate deception while maintaining an appearance of complete innocence. The afternoon brought Chief Inspector Davy back to Gossington Hall with the methodical precision that had already begun to distinguish his investigation from Inspector Slack's more obvious enthusiasms. Mrs. Bantry received him with barely contained excitement, her morning's discovery having elevated her from village observer to active participant in what she now described with relish as a proper mystery. The summer house, with its violated floorboards and missing portfolio, told a story that Miss Marple found far more revealing than the obvious narrative of hasty burglary. The disturbance showed a curious tidiness that spoke of careful hands rather than desperate haste. Dust had been swept into neat semicircles, and the lever marks on the floorboards displayed the precision of someone familiar with such work. More significantly, a spent match and the stub of a dark, pungently aromatic cigarette lay on the windowsill. Foreign tobacco of a type rarely seen in St. Mary Mead's more domestic establishments. "My brother-in-law smokes those dreadful black things when he comes down from town," Mrs. Bantry observed, with the satisfaction of providing useful intelligence. "Gives me a headache at 50 paces." The cigarette's continental origins seemed to hang in the damp air like an accusation, though Miss Marple reminded herself that such associations were most treacherous when they felt too convenient. Dr. Haydock's arrival with the laboratory results added another layer of complexity to the investigation. The granular residue from the library desk had revealed itself to be far more sophisticated than simple sugar, a compound preparation that would effectively mask the bitter almond taste of prussic acid while ensuring rapid absorption. "This isn't something an amateur would know to prepare," Haydock explained with professional gravity. "It requires specific chemical knowledge and access to materials not readily available to the general public." The implications were troubling when considered alongside the other carefully orchestrated elements of the crime. The killer possessed not only intimate knowledge of the manor's routines, but also specialized understanding of toxicology that extended far beyond what one might expect from even the most educated village resident. Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the curious psychology of such elaborate deception, someone who derived satisfaction from intellectual superiority. Someone who enjoyed demonstrating their ability to manipulate both the investigation and the investigators themselves. Young Arthur's reappearance at the manor provided the afternoon's most disturbing revelation. The boy had been waylaid by a gentleman whose face remained hidden beneath a pulled-down cap, though his voice carried the smooth authority of education and breeding. "Said it'd be best if I forgot watches and mantelpieces," Arthur whispered, his testimony made more credible by the bright half-crown he fidgeted with. Payment for selective memory that spoke of careful planning and substantial resources. The boy also recalled detecting a sharp, astringent odor in the library. Not the bitter almonds that had dominated previous discussions, but something reminiscent of the metal polish used for the brass fittings, though stronger and more chemical in nature. Miss Marple filed this detail alongside the others, recognizing how it might explain the killer's ability to handle the pocket watch without leaving fingerprints while ensuring its surface bore no trace of the original owner's habits. Miss Eleanor Thorne's growing distress had not escaped Miss Marple's gentle observation. The companion's usual composure showed increasing strain, her movements becoming more mechanical and her responses more carefully measured. When Chief Inspector Davy requested a private interview in the small sitting room overlooking the Yew Walk, Miss Thorne's agreement carried the weary resignation of someone who had been anticipating such a moment. Her revelations, delivered with exhausted precision, painted a picture of coercion rather than willing participation. Years spent in Switzerland as companion to an elderly invalid had provided her with knowledge of continental pharmaceutical practices, while a subsequent period in Italy had left her vulnerable to blackmail from someone who knew far too much about circumstances she preferred to forget. The violet notepaper, she admitted, had been written at another's instruction, a warning that was supposed to prevent scandal, not precipitate murder. He said he had letters, she confided to Miss Marple during a brief moment of privacy. He knew of my time in Italy, knew things that could destroy Lady Whitcombe's trust in me. I believed I was helping to prevent exposure, not enabling it. Her glance toward the French windows, where Mr. Carmichael's voice drifted in from the terrace, provided identification without requiring explicit accusation. The continental gentleman himself showed increasing signs of strain beneath his polished exterior. His questions about the investigation carried an urgency that seemed disproportionate to his supposed status as a village newcomer, while his offers of assistance possessed the calculated quality of someone seeking to control information flow. Miss Marple observed how his fingers drummed against his cigarette case in patterns that spoke of considerable inattention, and how his usual easy confidence had developed several hairline cracks. The discovery of a second violet-tinted note in Mr. Fortescue's private study provided additional confirmation of the plot's complexity. Unlike the urgent appointment message, this communication contained explicit threats. The Naples arrangement cannot continue. Exposure is inevitable unless immediate action is taken. The handwriting showed deliberate disguise, while the paper's watermark matched Lady Whitcombe's morning room supply, though the ink composition differed from the household's usual stock. As evening approached and the investigation's scope continued to expand, Miss Marple found herself increasingly convinced that the solution lay not in obvious financial motives or family tensions, but in the more subtle psychological pressures that drove seemingly respectable people to desperate acts. The killer's elaborate preparations spoke of meticulous planning combined with fatal overconfidence. Someone who believed their intellectual superiority would enable them to control every variable in an increasingly complex deception. The missing element, she realized, was the specific trigger that had transformed a successful criminal operation into a murder plot. Something had occurred in the days immediately preceding Mr. Fortescue's death that had made his continued existence intolerable to someone whose entire carefully constructed life depended on maintaining their respectable facade while concealing extensive criminal activities. The answer, Miss Marple suspected, would emerge when the killer's need for control finally exceeded their ability to maintain it. The evening brought Chief Inspector Davy back to Whitcombe Manor with a proposal that Miss Marple recognized as both ingenious and psychologically astute. A reconstruction of the crucial minutes before 10 would serve not merely to clarify the sequence of events, but to observe how each participant responded when forced to relive the moments surrounding Mr. Fortescue's death. People, she had long observed, found it remarkably difficult to maintain deceptions when confronted with the physical reality of their actions. The library was restored to its condition on the night of the ball, complete with a cut-glass decanter and sugar bowl positioned precisely as young Arthur remembered them. The household assembled with varying degrees of reluctance, their faces betraying the particular tension that accompanies enforced performance under scrutiny. Miss Eleanor Thorne took her position near the doorway with her hands clasped so tightly that her gloves strained across the knuckles, while Lady Whitcombe maintained her aristocratic composure despite the visible tremor in her fingers as she adjusted her pearls. Captain Hastings stood apart from the others, his military bearing somewhat diminished by the weight of recent revelations about his financial difficulties and youthful indiscretions. More significantly, Mr. Jason Carmichael positioned himself with careful casualness near the French windows, his continental polish intact, but his fingers drumming against his cigarette case in that familiar rhythm of inattention that Miss Marple had noted with increasing frequency. At precisely 2 minutes before 10, Chief Inspector Davy gave the signal for the reconstruction to begin. Arthur, pale but determined, entered the library bearing the same silver tray he had carried on the fatal evening. His movements were precise, almost ritualistic, as he placed the decanter and sugar bowl upon the desk where Mr. Fortescue had been found. Miss Marple, positioned with apparent casualness near the mantelpiece, noted how the young man's hand hesitated fractionally above the sugar bowl, as if some instinct warned him against completing the gesture. The first significant revelation came when Arthur, following his original routine, stepped back from the desk and glanced toward the doorway. His sharp intake of breath was audible in the library's tense silence. "That's him," he whispered, his voice barely carrying across the room. "The gentleman what spoke to me about forgetting things. He's standing just where he was that night, watching from the corridor." All eyes turned toward Mr. Carmichael, whose smooth composure finally showed its first genuine crack. The accusation hung in the air like smoke, transforming the Continental gentleman's presence from coincidental to sinister. His attempt at indignant denial was undermined by the visible perspiration that had appeared along his hairline despite the evening's chill. Dr. Haydock's arrival with additional laboratory results provided the evening's most damning evidence. The sophisticated compound used to mask the prussic acid's bitter taste required not only specialized knowledge but access to pharmaceutical supplies that would be virtually impossible for an amateur to obtain. More significantly, traces of a rare Italian preparation had been identified, something used in specialized medical treatments that pointed directly toward someone with continental connections and professional training. The curious thing about this particular compound, Haydock explained with scientific precision, is that it's manufactured exclusively by a pharmaceutical house in Milan. The formula is closely guarded, and distribution is strictly controlled through medical channels. Our killer didn't simply have chemical knowledge, they had specific access to materials that would be impossible to obtain through ordinary means. Miss Marple's gentle examination of the library's brass fittings revealed another crucial detail that had escaped official attention. The metal polish residue she detected was distinctly different from the lemon oil and beeswax used by the manor's staff. The sharp, ammonia-based compound was identical to the preparation she had noticed on Mr. Carmichael's meticulously maintained motor car, suggesting that the missing pocket watch had been cleaned with materials readily available to someone who took obsessive care of mechanical objects. The evening's most revealing moment came when Chief Inspector Davy mentioned with studied casualness that Scotland Yard had received interesting intelligence about financial irregularities involving Italian banking houses and their English intermediaries. Carmichael's reaction was instantaneous and uncontrollable, a momentary tightening around the eyes followed by the unconscious gesture of checking his inside jacket pocket, as if ensuring that crucial documents remained secure. Arthur's expanded testimony, delivered with the courage that comes from official protection, painted a picture of systematic intimidation that extended far beyond simple witness tampering. The foreign gentleman who had approached him possessed intimate knowledge of the manor's routines and had demonstrated familiarity with the investigation's progress that suggested either official involvement or sophisticated surveillance capabilities. More damning still was Arthur's recollection of detecting that sharp, chemical odor not only in the library but lingering in the conservatory and along the garden path that led to the old summer house. The scent trail suggested a carefully planned escape route that avoided the main corridors, where servants might observe unusual movements during the crucial minutes following Mr. Fortescue's death. Miss Marple's quiet observation that the violet notepaper found in the library showed signs of having been handled by someone wearing gloves, treated with the same metal polish, provided the final piece of physical evidence linking Carmichael directly to the crime scene. The combination of specialized pharmaceutical knowledge, access to rare Italian compounds, intimate familiarity with the manor's routines, and physical evidence placing him at the scene created a web of circumstantial proof that even his considerable intelligence could not explain away. As the evening drew toward its conclusion and the net of evidence tightened around him, Carmichael's carefully maintained facade began to crumble with the inexorable certainty that Miss Marple had long anticipated. His intellectual arrogance, which had driven him to create such an elaborate deception, was now becoming his greatest liability, as the very complexity of his scheme provided multiple points of exposure. The stage was set for a final confrontation that would test not only the authorities' ability to apprehend a dangerous and sophisticated criminal, but Miss Marple's understanding of the psychological pressures that transformed seemingly civilized individuals into calculating murderers, willing to eliminate anyone who threatened their carefully constructed lives. The hour following the reconstruction settled over Whitcombe Manor, with the particular weight that accompanies moments when carefully maintained facades begin to show their first hairline cracks. Chief Inspector Davy dismissed the assembly with characteristic efficiency, though Miss Marple noted with interest how certain individuals lingered in the corridors, their movements betraying the restless energy of people whose inner calculations had been suddenly disrupted by unexpected variables. Mr. Jason Carmichael's continental Polish, so unshakable throughout his residence in St. Mary Mead, showed its first genuine signs of strain as he attempted to process the implications of young Arthur's identification. His usual smooth confidence had developed several microscopic fractures, visible only to someone with Miss Marple's lifetime of experience in observing human nature under pressure. The way his fingers drummed against his cigarette case had accelerated into an almost frantic rhythm, while his glances toward the library door carried an urgency that seemed disproportionate to his supposed status as a concerned village newcomer. Lady Whitcombe, maintaining her aristocratic composure despite the evening's revelations, insisted upon offering refreshments in the morning room, as if the proper conduct of hospitality might yet restore some semblance of normalcy to her disrupted household. Miss Marple accepted the invitation with characteristic grace, positioning herself near the window where the lamplight fell kindly upon both the tea service and the faces of those who would soon move around it. The violet-tinted notepaper still lay upon the writing desk, its significance now understood by all present, though Miss Eleanor Thorne seemed unable to look directly at it without visible distress. Her hands trembled slightly as she arranged the tea things, the careful precision of her movements speaking of someone fighting to maintain control over circumstances that had spiraled far beyond her ability to manage. Miss Marple observed with gentle sympathy how the companion's left hand bore that telltale smudge of violet ink along the little finger, evidence of her unwilling participation in events she had never fully understood. As the small gathering settled into the uncomfortable ritual of taking tea while surrounded by the debris of a criminal investigation, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the curious psychology of elaborate deception. Her pale blue eyes moved with apparent casualness from face to face, noting the subtle tensions that revealed themselves when respectable people were forced to confront the possibility that evil had walked among them wearing the mask of continental charm and social respectability. "Such a relief that Mr. Fortescue's pocket watch has been recovered," she observed in her mildest tone, stirring her tea with the deliberate precision that had become second nature over 7 decades of village life. "Though I confess I find it rather curious that it should keep such perfect time now. Lady Whitcombe always mentioned how particular he was about running 3 minutes fast. Such a charming eccentricity, really." The effect of her words rippled through the small gathering like a stone dropped into still water. Carmichael's teacup rattled almost imperceptibly against its saucer, while his usual easy smile seemed to require considerable effort to maintain. Miss Marple continued her gentle stirring, apparently absorbed in the domestic ritual, while her keen observation missed nothing of his reaction. "Of course," she continued with the thoughtful air of someone working through a particularly intricate knitting pattern. "Anyone who knew Mr. Fortescue well would be aware of that little habit. A nephew would know naturally, or a lady's companion who had worked closely with him on estate matters. But a stranger, even a very observant one, might easily overlook such a personal detail when attempting to restore things to their proper condition. Chief Inspector Davy, who had been examining some papers with studied concentration, looked up with the sharp attention of a man who recognized significance when he heard it. The pocket watch, sitting in its evidence envelope on the side table, seemed suddenly to command the room's focus with the weight of unspoken accusation. Carmichael's attempt to dismiss the observation with continental sophistication fell considerably short of his usual standard. "Human foibles," he murmured, though the words sat unnaturally in his mouth. "One hardly notices such trivial details in times of crisis." "Oh, but that's precisely when one does notice them," Miss Marple replied with the gentle persistence that had served her so well in previous investigations. "Crisis has such a way of revealing the difference between genuine familiarity and careful observation. Rather like the difference between knowing that someone favors violet notepaper and understanding that they write left-handed, or recognizing the scent of foreign tobacco without realizing it leaves such distinctive ash." The morning room's atmosphere grew increasingly charged as Miss Marple's seemingly innocent observations began to weave themselves into a pattern that even the most determined self-deception could not ignore. Dr. Haydock's arrival with additional laboratory results provided the scientific foundation for what her psychological insights had already suggested. The sophisticated compound used to mask the prussic acid's bitter taste required not only specialized knowledge, but access to pharmaceutical supplies that would be virtually impossible for an amateur to obtain. "The preparation shows remarkable sophistication," Haydock explained with professional gravity. "The base compound is consistent with materials manufactured exclusively by a pharmaceutical house in Milan, while the coating technique requires knowledge of crystallization processes that extend well beyond amateur chemistry. Our killer possessed both technical expertise and access to materials that point toward professional training in pharmaceutical research." Miss Marple noted with interest how Carmichael's reaction to this revelation differed subtly from the shocked surprise displayed by the other members of the gathering. His expression carried the particular quality of someone receiving confirmation of feared possibilities rather than learning genuinely new information, while his unconscious gesture of checking his inside jacket pocket suggested concerns that extended far beyond the immediate implications of the laboratory analysis. As the evening drew toward its close and the net of circumstantial evidence continued to tighten around him, Carmichael's carefully maintained facade showed increasing signs of strain. His intellectual arrogance, which had driven him to create such an elaborate deception, was becoming his greatest liability, as the very complexity of his scheme provided multiple points of exposure to Miss Marple's gentle but relentless analysis of human behavior under pressure. The stage was set for a final confrontation that would test not only the authorities' ability to apprehend a sophisticated criminal, but Miss Marple's understanding of the psychological pressures that could transform a seemingly civilized individual into someone capable of calculated murder to protect their carefully constructed life of respectable criminality. The morning room's atmosphere had grown so charged with unspoken accusations that even the most determined attempt at social normalcy could no longer disguise the underlying tensions. Miss Marple, setting down her teacup with characteristic precision, allowed her pale blue eyes to rest thoughtfully upon Mr. Carmichael's increasingly strained features. The Continental gentleman's usual polish had developed several microscopic fractures that spoke volumes to someone with her lifetime of experience in observing human nature under pressure. "You know," she began, with the gentle, conversational tone that had so often preceded her most devastating revelations, "I've been thinking about timing this evening. Such a curious thing, really. How people remember events differently depending on their perspective." Her knitting needles resumed their soft clicking as she worked on the cream-colored shawl that had accompanied her throughout this investigation. Mr. Fortescue's pocket watch, for instance, tells us so much more than the time. Chief Inspector Davy leaned forward with the sharp attention of someone who recognized significance when he heard it, while Carmichael's fingers had ceased their drumming against his cigarette case and now gripped it with white-knuckled intensity. A man who kept his timepiece 3 minutes fast for 30 years doesn't suddenly develop different habits on the night of his death, Miss Marple continued with scholarly precision. Yet, when the watch was found in Captain Hastings' motor car, it kept perfect time, synchronized precisely with the town hall clock. Someone had corrected it, you see. Someone who understood that evidence must appear convincing, but lacked the intimate knowledge that would have preserved Mr. Fortescue's personal eccentricity. She paused in her knitting to examine a particularly intricate stitch, her apparent absorption in the domestic task making her next words all the more devastating. Rather, like using the correct violet notepaper but failing to realize that the writer was left-handed, or knowing about the sugar bowl's location without understanding that household sugar comes in lumps, not the fine powder needed to dissolve that sophisticated pharmaceutical compound. The silence that followed was broken only by the soft tick of the mantelpiece clock and Miss Eleanor Thorne's barely audible intake of breath. Lady Whitcombe sat frozen in aristocratic composure, while Dr. Haydick's medical training allowed him to recognize the signs of someone approaching the breaking point of carefully maintained self-control. The Naples correspondence was particularly illuminating, Miss Marple observed, her needles continuing their steady rhythm. Mr. Fortescue had discovered systematic irregularities in the European financial arrangements he was managing, not perpetrating them, but uncovering them. His final letter shows genuine alarm about what he had found, and his request for an urgent meeting suggests he was preparing full disclosure rather than concealment. Carmichael's attempt to maintain his continental sophistication was crumbling with visible effort. These are fascinating theories, Miss Marple. But hardly. Oh, but they're not theories at all, she interrupted with gentle firmness. They're observations about human behavior, which I've found to be remarkably consistent over the years. The chemical knowledge required for that poison compound, the access to rare Italian pharmaceutical preparations, the systematic financial fraud operating through European channels. These all point to someone with very specific professional background and continental connections. Chief Inspector Davy rose with practiced efficiency. We've received confirmation from Interpol, Mr. Carmichael. Your real name is Carlo Moretti. You were formerly a research chemist dismissed for industrial espionage and suspected involvement in black market pharmaceutical dealings. The confession that followed poured out with the bitter satisfaction of someone whose careful performance had finally been exposed. The European financial network had been his creation, using respectable English intermediaries like Fortescue to launder money from various continental sources. When Fortescue's conscience had inconveniently awakened and he began preparing to expose the entire operation, elimination had become the only solution. The watch was supposed to implicate Hastings, he continued with the pride of someone explaining a particularly clever solution. The gambling debts, the family tensions, the convenient access to the library. It should have been perfect, but you couldn't leave well enough alone, could you? Miss Marple's expression remained gentle despite the venom in his voice. The details are never meaningless, Mr. Carmichael. They tell the story of who we really are beneath the masks we wear. Your mistake wasn't in the planning. That was quite sophisticated. Your mistake was in believing that intellectual superiority could overcome the fundamental truth that evil always contains the seeds of its own exposure. As Davy and his sergeant moved to make the arrest, Carmichael's final attempt at escape through the French windows was swiftly thwarted by officers positioned during the evening's careful orchestration. Miss Eleanor Thorne, released from the terrible burden of her unwilling complicity, wept quietly while Lady Whitcombe maintained her aristocratic composure despite visible trembling. The autumn morning that followed brought curious restoration to St. Mary Mead, as if the village itself had exhaled a breath held since that terrible evening at Lady Whitcombe's ball. Miss Marple, taking her customary walk to the post office, reflected on the eternal human tendency to believe that intelligence alone could overcome moral consequences of criminal behavior. The case had reminded her once again that the most elaborate deceptions often crumbled not through dramatic confrontations, but through accumulation of small inconsistencies that revealed the difference between performed knowledge and genuine understanding. Evil, no matter how sophisticated its presentation, invariably betrayed itself through the very pride that made it believe it could manipulate truth itself. As she settled into her garden chair with fresh knitting and the morning paper's account of the arrest, Miss Marple found herself grateful for the restoration of village normalcy, though she knew that beneath St. Mary Mead's respectable surface, human nature continued its eternal struggle between civilization and darker impulses. A struggle that would undoubtedly provide future opportunities for her particular talents in observation and understanding.